The celestial concordat had governed the ascended species for 11,000 years. Its membership requirement was simple, and almost no one had ever met it. A species had to prove it could not be destroyed by any single ascended being acting alone. In 11,000 years, 41 species had applied. 6 had been admitted. The rest had either failed the proof, or had been the proof, used as the demonstration by whichever ascended wanted to remind the chamber why the requirement existed. The concordat's central hall sat inside a structure called the Silence, a ring-shaped station built from the bones of a dead sun. It had no weapons of its own. It had never needed any. Any ascended who threatened the Silence was, by definition, threatening every other ascended who might one day need the same neutral ground, and none of them were foolish enough to make that enemy. Ascended beings did not age, did not tire, and did not forget. When they made an assessment, it stayed made for centuries. The last new member species, the Corvin Choir, had waited 1900 years between application and acceptance, and had spent most of that time being tested by increasingly senior ascended who wanted to be certain the file wasn't flattering itself. Humanity had applied 4 years ago. The application had been quiet, unaccompanied by ceremony, filed by a species barely 2 centuries into faster-than-light travel. No one on the council had expected the file to still be open. Several had expected it to be closed within the month, the way most were. It was not closed. It had simply gone unread, buried under older, more established business, until Chancellor Voss pulled it herself. Rill Aiden was 31 years old, human, born in a settlement that no longer had a name because the war that ended it had also ended the records. Chancellor Voss, who processed applications for the Concordat, had read Rill's file 6 times. The first 2 readings, she assumed it was written by someone with an agenda. The numbers were arranged too cleanly, the sourcing too clean for what the file claimed. The next 4 readings were spent trying to find the error. There wasn't one. Every claim traced back to a verified engagement, cross-referenced against 3 independent ascended observation posts that had no reason to coordinate a lie. Rill had arrived at the Silence with a single case, checked once at the gate, and had not mentioned its contents to anyone. The gate officer, a Farron ascended with 400 years of screening experience, had asked what was inside, mostly out of habit. "Something from home," Rill said, and did not elaborate. The officer let it through unopened. Later, that decision would be reviewed by 3 separate Concordat security boards, none of whom found anything they could have done differently. He found his assigned quarters, unpacked the case, and reported to orientation on time. He did not introduce himself as anything other than Rill from Earth. He asked no questions during orientation that weren't procedural, where to eat, how the translation matrices handled idiom, what the local day cycle was called. Nobody in the room understood yet that this was already an answer to a question they hadn't asked. Chancellor Voss watched him from the observation gallery during that first orientation and thought, not for the first time, that the file had undersold him. Files usually oversold. This one hadn't even tried. The challenge came during the welcome assembly in front of the other delegate species, 11 of them, all ascended adjacent, all with centuries or millennia of Concordat history behind them. New applicant species were traditionally given the floor first, a courtesy that doubled in practice as an audition. Ambassador Threll, a vain ascended, second in line for his species seat, an undefeated informal challenge for over 300 years, had chosen his seat near the front early, before the room filled. He was known across the Concordat for a particular skill, identifying which new species would be easy, and making sure the room agreed with his assessment before anyone else had formed their own. He asked the human question the way certain ascended ask questions, which is to say, with the timing and tone of someone who has prepared it, rehearsed the delivery, and chosen the room for maximum effect. He waited until the ambient conversation had died down on its own, so that his voice would be the one that filled the silence. Humanity is new, Threll said, addressing the chamber rather than Rill directly. New species like to arrive with impressive numbers. So, for the record, since we'll all be working together, how many gods has humanity killed? Several delegates smiled. It was the category of smile that happens in rooms where a hierarchy is being enforced, not the kind that happens when something is funny. That's a reasonable question, Rill said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it reasonable. Do you mean confirmed kills, or total engagements where an ascended combatant was neutralized regardless of survival? The room's amusement did not fully register the shift yet. Confirmed, Threll said, recovering his composure. Confirmed kills. Rill said a number. The smiles stopped not all at once, but the way a wave stops, the ones closest to Rill first, then spreading outward through the chamber. Chancellor Voss, seated at the head of the assessment table, said nothing during the exchange. She had been waiting for this moment since her 6th reading of the file, 3 weeks earlier. She opened the archive terminal and released the footage she had already pulled and verified. It was not dramatic in the way Concordat training simulations were dramatic. It was documentary, helmet recordings, station logs, a settlement's last transmission before it stopped. The first case study showed an ascended warlord who had claimed an entire agricultural colony as tribute. Rill's team had been 6 people. The footage ran 11 minutes before the warlord's signature went dark. The second showed a single engagement, no team, just Rill, in a collapsed transit tunnel, against an ascended who had spent 4 centuries undefeated in single combat. The footage was grainy. It did not need to be clear to make the point. By the third case study, Threll was not smiling. He was watching with the expression of someone doing a calculation that was going to take longer than the assembly period to finish. The fourth case study was quieter than the others, a single frame, time-stamped, showing an ascended ceremonial mark, submitted as proof of kill to a human command post that no longer existed. The room was silent while it played. Nobody in the chamber said a word. The silence itself did more work than any reaction could have. The fifth case study ran longer than the others, and was the one Chancellor Voss had cued deliberately for the delegates seated closest to Threll. It showed a joint operation. Rill alongside 2 others, human names the translation matrix rendered without titles or rank, against an ascended who had held a border system uncontested for over a century. The footage showed no speeches, no declarations. It showed 3 people doing a job methodically, checking each other's positions, and leaving before the system's local sun had fully risen. The ascended in question had not been seen since. The 6th case study was a single still image, a settlement, intact, 3 years after the engagement that had saved it. Children in a courtyard, no caption. Voss let it sit on the display longer than any of the others. The 7th and final case study was the shortest. It was audio-only, Rill's voice, recorded 4 years earlier, giving a status report to someone off mic. Objective complete. No further contact expected from this one. Nothing else. The transmission ended there. Rill did not speak during any of it. He watched the footage with the room, the same neutral attention he'd given the assembly room's architecture on the way in. Threll stopped at the chamber doors on his way out. "The number you gave me," he said, "and the number in that footage, they're not the same count." "No," Rill said. "The number I gave you was confirmed kills. That footage is engagements. They overlap by about 60. Threll left without another word, not humiliated, recalibrating. The door closed behind him quietly. Voss crossed the emptying chamber to where Rill was gathering his materials. "Since the 2nd week your file was open," she said, "I was waiting for the right moment to bring that footage. I didn't expect to need it on the first day." "It's a reasonable question to want answered," Rill said. "Better it's answered now than assumed later." Voss looked at him for a moment longer than the exchange required, then nodded once, the way people do when a private assessment has just been confirmed rather than changed. Rill closed the case he'd brought with him. the one he'd checked at the gate, still unopened in the room, containing nothing anyone had asked about yet, and picked it back up to return to his quarters. Chancellor Voss opened humanity's Concordat assessment file and wrote 3 words. 3 words.